He froze where he stood, heart pounding, breath stuck in his throat. For years, his body had been lifeless, unresponsive, a source of silent shame he'd carried alone. But when her fingers brushed against his while passing a cup of coffee, something inside him woke up, raw, electric, and terrifyingly alive. He stepped back, shaken, staring at her as though she'd just unlocked a secret he never meant to share. The world didn't move. Just her, just him, and something he couldn't explain. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. Mason Holbrook was a man who looked like he had it all, but nothing inside him worked anymore. At 38, he was already a self-made billionaire, the founder of a successful logistics company that stretched across the Midwest. People in Illinois called him brilliant, cold, composed, a man who didn't bend or break. But behind the expensive suits and silent stares, Mason lived in quiet humiliation. Because the one thing that made him feel like a man had vanished. It started after his marriage began to crumble. His wife, Tiffany, had been everything a man like him was expected to have: beautiful, elegant, sharp. They'd met young, back when he was still hungry, and she was dazzled by his drive. But over the years, Mason's work became his escape from emotion. Late nights at the office, missed anniversaries, long silences at the dinner table. It was like watching two strangers share a home. When Tiffany finally left, she didn't just take her things. She took the last piece of pride he had. The night she walked out, she said one thing that never left his head. "I can't stay married to a man who doesn't even feel like one anymore." She didn't mean money or power, she meant the bedroom. The shame ate at him. The doctors said it was psychological. His body was fine, his tests were fine, but his mind had shut off the switch. Some called it stress, others called it trauma, but Mason knew what it really was: punishment. For neglect. For losing touch with what mattered. He left Chicago 6 months later and moved into his quieter estate in Bloomington, Illinois. Away from the noise, away from judgment, away from everything that reminded him of failure. He didn't need company, or so he told himself. But when the house started to feel like a tomb, he called a small local agency to hire a live-in maid. That's when Zara Benton arrived. She wasn't what he expected. No polished accent, no forced smiles, no pretension. Just a 32-year-old black woman with soft eyes, a calm voice, and the kind of presence that made rooms feel less empty. Zara came from Peoria, a single mother raising a teenage son who wanted to be an engineer. Life had been rough: 2 jobs, unpaid bills, constant exhaustion, but she carried her struggles with quiet dignity. Mason respected that. The first few weeks were simple. She worked, he worked. She cleaned, he kept to himself. But small moments began to catch him off guard. Zara humming while folding laundry. Zara laughing softly when the dog stole her cleaning rag. Zara knocking gently before entering his office with fresh coffee, even though he never asked. There was something about her, an unspoken gentleness that disarmed him. She didn't treat him like a billionaire. She treated him like a man who needed peace. And for the first time in years, Mason realized how long it had been since someone looked at him without expectation. Still, he kept his distance. He didn't want her to see the broken parts, the parts Tiffany had mocked and walked away from. Every morning, he'd watch her from his study window as she watered the garden or swept the porch. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was something quieter. Something that felt like breathing again. Zara, too, noticed the heaviness in him. The way he rarely smiled. The way his shoulders always seemed tense. She didn't pry. She just made small efforts, leaving fresh fruit by his coffee cup, adjusting his tie before meetings, reminding him to take a walk outside. He didn't say much, but he noticed everything. One evening, as she cleaned his office, she accidentally knocked over a photo frame, a picture of Mason and Tiffany from happier days. The glass cracked down the middle. Zara apologized immediately, but Mason just stared at it, at the line dividing his past from his present. Then quietly he said, "Maybe it's better this way." That was the first time she heard him speak more than 5 words. The next morning, she found him sitting on the porch before sunrise. The air was still, the sky faintly orange. Without asking, she placed a cup of coffee beside him and sat a few feet away. No words. No expectations. Just company. And that silence was what started to heal him. Days turned into weeks. Mason began to find rhythm in simplicity, Zara's humming, the smell of breakfast, the sound of her footsteps down the hall. The house no longer echoed. But still, he couldn't shake the fear that he'd never be whole again. He'd become so used to shame that even peace felt foreign. Then one morning, something shifted. As Zara handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed, just barely. But the jolt that ran through him was undeniable. His pulse quickened, his breath caught. He felt something. Something alive, something he hadn't felt in years. He set the cup down too quickly, spilling a little. Zara didn't notice. She just smiled and said softly, "Careful, it's hot." But Mason wasn't thinking about the coffee. He was thinking about the spark that came from a simple touch, and how terrifyingly human it felt. That night, Mason lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had changed. It wasn't lust. It wasn't desire. It was warmth, and the terrifying realization that he wasn't as broken as he thought. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like an enemy. And deep down, Mason knew something had begun, something he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. Sometimes healing doesn't come from doctors or therapy, it comes from the hands of someone who simply sees you. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, you'll understand why Mason's story matters. Don't miss what happens next. Mason tried to convince himself that what happened that morning was nothing, just a nervous response, a flicker of energy, maybe even imagination. But his body betrayed him. Every time Zara walked past him, every time her laughter filled the kitchen, something inside him stirred awake, quiet but undeniable. He didn't know what scared him more, the fact that it was happening, or that it was happening because of her. Zara Benton, the woman who had entered his home quietly and changed its rhythm without trying. The woman who never once treated him like a man with money, only like a man who needed gentleness. Mason started noticing little things. How she always tucked her curls into a scarf when she worked. How she hummed old soul tunes while cooking. How she carried kindness in every gesture, like it was a habit she couldn't break. He'd never met anyone like her. But every time his eyes lingered too long, he reminded himself of the truth. He was her employer, and he was broken. She deserved more than a man who had forgotten what connection felt like. Still, the universe seemed determined to test his restraint. One morning he found her outside by the garage, struggling to fix the lawnmower. The sleeves of her shirt were rolled up, grease on her hands, the sun catching the gold in her skin. Mason walked over, saying he'd take care of it, but Zara shook her head and laughed. He hadn't heard a sound that pure in years. As he crouched beside her to help, his hand brushed hers again, and it happened. The same spark. That same rush through his veins, uninvited and unstoppable. He froze. His heart was hammering, his breath short, his pulse alive. Zara didn't seem to notice. She just kept working, focused, determined. But Mason had to stand up and walk away before she saw the tremor in his hands. That night, he sat at his desk long after she'd gone to her room. His reflection in the window looked different. Not just tired, but human again. For so long, he'd thought that part of him was dead, buried under guilt and loss. But somehow, without meaning to, she had brought him back to life. He hated that it scared him. He'd spent years believing emotions were dangerous, that they weakened a man. That's what Tiffany had taught him. His ex-wife thrived on appearances. To her, vulnerability was a flaw. But with Zara, every quiet moment felt safe. There was no judgment in her eyes, no sharp words, just understanding. And the more he tried to distance himself, the closer life seemed to push them together. One evening, heavy rain poured through the small town of Bloomington. The roads were slick, and the power flickered off just after sunset. Zara was in the kitchen finishing dinner, and Mason, restless, walked in with a flashlight. The house felt smaller, warmer in the dark, just the two of them and the soft scent of rain outside. Zara handed him a towel to dry his hair. Their fingers touched again, and this time, Mason didn't pull away. He froze, not out of fear but realization. He wanted this. For a moment, The air was thick with things neither could say. Then the lights came back on, breaking the silence, and Zara stepped back, clearing her throat, pretending nothing had happened. But something had. Later that night, Mason couldn't sleep. His body felt alive again. Not just physically, but emotionally. He thought about the years he'd wasted chasing the wrong kind of affection. He thought about how easily Zara's presence had healed what doctors and therapists couldn't. The next day, something unusual happened. Zara came to him with a small envelope in her hand. She looked nervous, almost apologetic. It was her resignation letter. She said she couldn't stay. That she'd been offered more hours at her second job in Peoria, and she needed to take care of her son. Mason's chest tightened as he read her words. The room felt colder all of a sudden. He wanted to ask her to stay, not because he needed a maid, but because he couldn't imagine waking up without her soft footsteps echoing down the hall. But he couldn't say it. Not yet. Instead, he just nodded and said he understood. Zara smiled faintly, thanked him for everything, and said she'd leave by the end of the week. That night, Mason sat alone again, the same way he had for years before she came. But this time, the silence hurt differently. He realized what scared him most wasn't losing her job, it was losing her presence, the feeling of being seen without judgment. He'd fallen in love with the calm she brought to his storm. He walked into the kitchen, hoping maybe she was still awake, but the lights were off. On the counter sat a note in her handwriting. "Thank you for treating me like a person, not an employee. You're a good man, Mason, even if you don't see it yet." Her words hit him like a blow. Because no one had called him good in years. Not since Tiffany left. Not since his life turned cold. He sat there for hours, rereading that note, fighting a storm inside him that he couldn't suppress anymore. The next morning, he woke up determined. He wouldn't let her walk away, not this time. When he found her outside by the garden, packing her small car, the words spilled out before he could think. He told her she didn't have to leave. That she'd become part of his home, his life, and that her presence had done more for him than she could ever imagine. Zara was silent for a long moment. She looked at him, truly looked, as if searching for the truth behind his words. And then, quietly, she said she'd think about it. But as she turned to go, Mason's heart skipped again, that same electric pulse. It was clear now, what his doctors called broken was never about the body. It was about feeling safe. About connection. About love. And he only felt that when she was near. But later that week, as Mason prepared to tell her the truth about what she had unknowingly healed, a familiar voice from the past appeared at his door. Tiffany, the ex-wife who had broken him. And she had one question that would change everything. "So, it's true? You can finally feel again?" When Mason opened the front door that morning, his chest tightened like someone had stolen the air from his lungs. Tiffany Caldwell stood there, poised as ever, her designer coat clinging to her frame, eyes scanning the house she once called hers. She hadn't changed much, but Mason had. For a second, neither spoke. Rain misted the porch, and all he could hear was the faint hum of the town waking up. Then she smiled, that sharp practice smile that used to make him feel small. She said she'd heard things. That people in town were talking. About him. About the woman living in his house. About how he'd started looking alive again. Her tone wasn't curiosity. It was control. The same control she'd always used to make him doubt himself. Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tiffany had never been one for silence. She filled it fast. She said she wanted to talk. She had questions. But all Mason heard was the sound of the past clawing its way back into his present. He let her in. Out of politeness, not desire. And the moment she stepped inside, the house felt smaller, heavier, like it had lost its warmth. Zara appeared from the kitchen, holding a basket of laundry. The look on her face when she saw Tiffany was confusion at first, then quiet recognition. She'd seen that look in Mason's eyes when he spoke about her. Tiffany gave Zara the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all, the kind that told you exactly where you stood. Mason introduced them with the awkward grace of a man standing between two worlds that shouldn't collide. And yet, they did. Tiffany complimented the house, saying it looked surprisingly alive. Then her gaze shifted toward Zara, her tone turning sharper. "So this is the reason, huh? Zara froze, unsure if she should answer. Mason cut in before she could. He told Tiffany to leave it alone, that she didn't have the right to walk back into his life and question his choices. But Tiffany wasn't the type to back down. She leaned closer and whispered, "You couldn't even look at me for months. Now, suddenly you're a new man? What changed?" Her question wasn't curiosity. It was accusation. Mason didn't know how to answer, because the truth, that his body and soul had come alive again only because of Zara's presence, felt too fragile to share. Especially in front of Tiffany. After Tiffany left, Zara quietly finished her chores and avoided him. Mason could feel the distance growing between them, a distance born from guilt, confusion, and something deeper, fear. That night, Zara stayed in her room. Mason sat on the porch, staring out into the dark streets of Bloomington. He thought about everything. His brokenness, the humiliation Tiffany had left him with, and the strange, unexplainable way Zara had become the only person who made him feel human again. He realized something that night. Tiffany didn't just break him physically, she broke the part of him that believed in love. Zara hadn't fixed his problem, she had reminded him what emotional safety felt like. And that was what changed everything. The next morning, Zara approached him in the kitchen. She looked hesitant but calm. She asked if he was okay, and Mason nodded. Then she said something that pierced through him. She said she didn't want to be the reason for problems between him and his past. That she'd seen enough of how powerful women like Tiffany could destroy quiet men like him. She didn't want to be another source of chaos in his life. Her words hurt because they were true, not in meaning but in fear. Mason wanted to tell her that she wasn't chaos. She was peace. The first peace he'd felt in years. But the words didn't come out right. So instead, he said what he always did, "I'll be fine." Zara smiled softly, but he could see the sadness in her eyes. That night, she didn't come down for dinner. Mason ate alone, the way he used to, only now the silence was unbearable. He realized how much her presence had become part of his healing, how she'd quietly filled the spaces Tiffany left empty. He found himself scrolling through his phone later, looking at photos he'd never deleted, pictures of the life Tiffany had curated for them, all perfection and pretense. Then he looked at a photo Zara had taken by accident earlier that week, just her shadow on the kitchen wall, sunlight across the tiles. It was simple, unposed, real. That was the difference. Tiffany lived for appearances. Zara lived for truth. Mason finally understood that he wasn't broken anymore. He had just been trying to love someone who never truly saw him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel shame for what he felt. He felt gratitude. Sometimes, life doesn't heal you with doctors or therapy. It heals you with people, the kind that see your pain before you even say a word. If you've ever met someone who quietly fixed what the world broke in you, then you already understand what Mason felt that night. Maybe that's reason enough to stay, to listen, and to believe again. A few days later, Tiffany came back. This time, she wasn't alone. She brought a man, the one she'd left Mason for. A clean-cut, confident figure named Eli Davenport. She said she only came by to apologize, but Mason knew better. Her eyes darted toward Zara as if she needed to prove something. As if Mason's peace was a personal insult to her. Zara watched from the hallway as Tiffany reached for Mason's hand and said, "I'm glad you're doing better. It's nice to know someone else succeeded where I couldn't." That's when Zara stepped forward. Calm, steady, unbothered. She said Tiffany didn't fail, she just stopped trying to love him. Mason froze. Zara's voice didn't shake, it was firm but kind. Tiffany looked embarrassed for the first time in her life. The tension in the room was thick, and when Tiffany and her man finally left, the air felt lighter, like the ghosts of Mason's past had finally walked out with her. Mason looked at Zara and saw her differently, not as a maid, not even as the woman who healed him, but as someone who saw his worth long before he did. That night, they sat together on the porch. No words, just shared silence. The kind of silence that says more than language ever could. But just as peace settled between them, Mason got a phone call. From his doctor. The same one who had once told him he'd never recover. The doctor sounded shocked. He said the new results didn't make sense. Mason's condition hadn't just improved, it had completely reversed. And that night, Mason realized what he'd been too afraid to admit all along. It wasn't medicine that changed him. It was love. Mason sat in silence after the call ended, the phone still warm in his palm. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the streetlights outside, the heartbeat pounding in his chest. His doctor's words kept echoing in his head. It's like your body rewired itself. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But Mason knew it wasn't whatever. It was who. He turned toward the living room, where Zara sat folding laundry. The dim light from the lamp fell across her face, soft and unbothered. She was humming a tune, something quiet and familiar, the way people do when they feel at home. For a second, Mason just watched her, realizing that this woman, this stranger who'd walked into his life by chance, had somehow healed the part of him that the world had written off as lost. He wanted to tell her what the doctor said, but the words got stuck. How do you tell someone that your body only works when they're near? That your strength, your joy, your very manhood, all seem to answer to their presence? So he kept it to himself. At least for that night. Over the next few days, things between them grew quiet. Not tense, just thoughtful. Mason tried to carry on as normal, but every time he caught Zara's reflection in the window, or heard her laughter in another room, a warmth stirred in him that he couldn't ignore. And she felt it too. Zara found herself thinking about him even when she shouldn't. When she cooked, she thought of how he liked his coffee. When she cleaned, she noticed how his hands had started to steady again, how his eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, had begun to shine. It scared her, because she'd never been the reason behind someone's healing before. Then came the night she almost left. It was late, and the rain outside poured like the sky itself was breaking. Zara stood by her packed suitcase, heart pounding, hands trembling. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that she'd come into Mason's life to help, not to fall in love with him. She had written a short note, nothing dramatic, just a few words. Thank you for everything. You deserve peace, not confusion. But when she opened the door to leave, Mason was standing right there. He didn't ask where she was going. He just looked at her with quiet eyes, full of pain and fear, as if he already knew. And that was all it took. She dropped the suitcase. He stepped closer. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows and their shared breathing. Zara whispered that she couldn't stay because it wasn't right, that she worked for him, that people would talk, that his ex-wife would use it against him if she found out. But Mason didn't care about any of that anymore. He said he'd spent too many years pretending to live a life that looked perfect but felt hollow. Now, for the first time, he wanted something real. He reached for her hand, hesitating just enough for her to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. When their hands met, something unspoken passed between them, not lust, not desperation, but recognition. Two people who had spent years feeling unseen finally found someone who truly looked at them. That night, they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything, about longing, about healing, about how sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with peace. The next morning, the world outside looked new. The sun seemed brighter, the air cleaner. Even Mason's steps felt lighter. But peace never lasts long when it comes with risk. A week later, Tiffany showed up again, this time unannounced, furious, and suspicious. Rumors had spread. Someone had seen Mason and Zara at a local diner together, sharing breakfast like old lovers. Tiffany stormed in, demanding answers. Mason didn't flinch. He told her calmly that she no longer had the right to dictate who he saw or how he lived. Tiffany laughed, saying she didn't care about him, only about her reputation. But her eyes betrayed something else, jealousy. Zara stood at the edge of the room, wanting to disappear but refusing to run. Tiffany turned to her, hurling cruel words, calling her names, saying she'd taken advantage of a broken man. Before Mason could speak, Zara did. She said she never took anything from him. In fact, she gave him something Tiffany never could, peace. Tiffany left in a rage. But her visit left a shadow. Because while Mason felt liberated, Zara felt exposed. That night, she couldn't sleep. The words Tiffany spat still echoed in her mind. You'll ruin him. And for the first time, Zara believed it might be true. There's a kind of love that doesn't shout, it just shows up and stays. But when the world starts whispering against it, even the purest hearts begin to doubt themselves. If you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, then you already know how much courage it takes just to stay. Maybe that's what real love is, not perfection but endurance. The following morning, Mason woke up to find Zara sitting outside on the porch, still in her robe, staring into the distance. Her eyes were tired, but her face was calm, too calm. She said she had something to tell him. She said she'd gotten a call from her sister in Atlanta, that she'd been offered a job there, something stable, something respectable. Mason's heart sank. He asked if she was taking it. She said she didn't know yet, that maybe leaving was the best thing for both of them. He didn't argue. He just looked at her the way a man looks at the only thing that ever felt right and knows he's about to lose it. As she stood up to walk back inside, Mason finally said what he'd been holding in for weeks. That doctor called again. He said I'm completely healthy. He said whatever was wrong with me before is gone. You want to know what changed me, Zara? You did. Her eyes filled with tears. But instead of joy, it was fear. Fear that what they had couldn't survive the world outside those walls. That night, Zara didn't pack her things. But when Mason woke up the next morning, her suitcase was gone. No note. No goodbye. Only the faint scent of her perfume in the hallway. And on the table, his phone buzzed with a single message, from Tiffany. You should have known, Mason. People like her never stay. The days after Zara's departure felt longer than Mason thought possible. The house, once full of quiet movement, the faint sound of a broom on tile, the hum of her voice while she worked, now felt hollow. Every corner reminded him of her. The coffee mug she favored still sat on the counter. Her favorite cardigan hung on the back of a chair. He couldn't bring himself to move any of it. It felt like erasing her would mean losing the last part of himself that still felt alive. He went to work, met with his lawyers, returned calls, but it was all muscle memory. His thoughts kept circling back to her, the way she'd glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking, the warmth in her voice when she said his name, the peace that came over him just by having her near. Days turned to weeks. Then, one evening, Mason found himself driving, no destination in mind. He just needed air, distance, something. The sun was setting over the rolling fields outside Chicago, painting the sky in gold and orange. He pulled over on a quiet back road and sat there, staring into the horizon, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when he realized something. He hadn't just lost a woman. He'd lost his reason, his balance, his faith in connection. Zara hadn't just awakened his body, she'd awakened his soul. And maybe, for once in his life, he wasn't supposed to let someone walk away without fighting for them. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He followed his heart. Mason called every contact he could find, asking if anyone knew where Zara had gone. It took days, but he finally found her, in a small community in Atlanta, where she'd taken a job at a local youth center. He didn't tell her he was coming. He just boarded a plane and went. When he arrived, he saw her before she saw him. She was outside, reading stories to a group of children. The same soft expression, the same quiet grace. But something in her eyes had changed. She looked peaceful, but also distant, as if she'd built walls to keep from breaking again. He stood there for a while, watching. He didn't want to disrupt her world, but he also knew he couldn't live another day pretending he didn't need her. When their eyes finally met, she froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she stood and walked toward him. There were no tears, no dramatic scene. Just two people who'd already shared everything in silence once before. She asked why he came. He said he couldn't stay away. He told her about the empty mornings, the quiet dinners, the way even his house, the house that once symbolized success, now felt like a tomb. He said he didn't come to drag her back. He came to tell her that home wasn't a place for him anymore. It was a person. Zara's eyes filled, and she said she'd left because she didn't want to ruin his life. Because Tiffany's words had made her believe she was just another scandal waiting to happen. But Mason shook his head. He said the only thing that had ever ruined him was living a life that looked perfect but wasn't. And that he'd rather be whispered about for loving her than pitted for being lonely. They sat on the park bench for hours, saying all the things they hadn't said before. Zara told him about her childhood, about growing up in a neighborhood where people rarely dreamed past survival, about how she'd never imagined being seen by a man like him, not because of his wealth, but because of how he looked at her like she mattered. Mason told her about his failures, not the financial ones, but the emotional ones. How he'd spent his life chasing success so he wouldn't have to face his own emptiness. It wasn't a grand confession. It was two broken pieces fitting together without force. When the sun dipped behind the trees, Mason finally asked her if she'd come back with him, not as a maid, not as a secret, but as his equal. Zara hesitated. She said she didn't want to be saved. He smiled and said he didn't want to save her, he wanted to choose her. For the first time since she left, she laughed, a real, full laugh that reached her eyes. And that was when she finally said yes. Back in Illinois, life didn't magically fix itself. The whispers came. The judgment followed. Some of Mason's old associates mocked him behind his back. But he didn't care. He was finally living honestly. Zara continued her studies in psychology and began volunteering at local shelters. Mason supported her quietly, proud but never possessive. Their love wasn't loud, it was steady. Months later, Mason woke up to the sound of laughter in the kitchen. Zara was there, barefoot, making breakfast. The sunlight caught her face just right, and something about that moment, the simplicity of it, made him realize how far he'd come. No grand mansions. No boardroom triumphs. Just peace. He wrapped his arms around her, kissed her forehead, and whispered that he'd never known life could feel this calm. She smiled and said, "Maybe that's what healing sounds like, quiet." Some people think love should look perfect, flawless, public, celebrated. But maybe real love is the kind that grows in the shadows, the kind that heals without needing applause. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel seen when the world didn't, then you already know, those are the stories worth holding on to. Months passed, and Mason and Zara decided to marry, privately, in the backyard under the same tree where she used to hang the laundry. No guests. No cameras. Just the two of them, and the life they'd built from the ruins of their old ones. And when they exchanged vows, Mason said something simple but unforgettable. "For years, I thought being a man meant having everything. But the truth is, I didn't become one until I met you." Zara's eyes welled with tears. She whispered back, "And I didn't believe in miracles until you stopped needing to be one." The wind picked up, scattering petals across the grass, and Mason felt a peace so complete it almost frightened him. He looked at the woman who had walked into his brokenness and stayed long enough to rebuild it, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. Mason and Zara's story wasn't the kind people made headlines about. It didn't start with perfection, and it didn't end with applause. But somewhere between pain and healing, two hearts that the world almost forgot found each other, and stayed.